Over the last week, Israel has heightened its attacks in the West Bank, sending in their settler militias to, among other things, arrest 23 Palestinians and demolishing the home of a man killed by Israeli settlers in July, advancing a plan for another 627 settler thefts of homes and land in the West Bank, and they continued torturing Dr. Abu Safia in their own version of Guantanamo Bay. Keeping with that theme, the story that caught my eye today in the Philadelphia Inquirer that I want to talk about is buried on page A4. Let's take a look. The headline reads, Netanyahu walks tightrope over Trump's Gaza plan. And the story begins. It's possibly the most important job of any Israeli prime minister, maintain good relations with the United States while pushing back on demands seen as undermining Israel's security. No one has managed the balancing act longer than Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's longest-serving leader. But with the Iran war at a stalemate and U.S. President Donald Trump looking to advance peace efforts elsewhere is Gaza, Netanyahu's task is getting harder less than 3 months away from Israeli elections. On Sunday, Netanyahu rejected Trump's latest plan to advance the stalled ceasefire in Gaza, saying Israel will not withdraw from any of the roughly 60% of the territory it controls until Hamas has been completely disarmed, something the militant group controlling the other 40% has long resisted. The thing they're not telling you is that Hamas has agreed to this. They've already said that they will, but Israel first has to withdraw its troops. Seems pretty fucking reasonable to me. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Netanyahu risks angering Trump, who he has repeatedly said is the greatest friend Israel has ever had in the White House. But even a hint of compromise with Hamas could be fatal for Netanyahu's re-election in a country deeply traumatized by the October 7, 2023 attack that happened on his watch. And there are stories out there that he's the one who armed Hamas. He staged October 7th. He wanted it to happen so that he could appease his far-right Ben Gvir-looking little shits to go ahead and proceed with the Zionist agenda. But we'll come back to that. Trump, meanwhile, is under pressure to deliver on his promise of being a global peacemaker as talks with Iran stall and gas prices stay elevated ahead of U.S. congressional elections in November. Netanyahu, no progress on Gaza ceasefire until Hamas disarms. The Gaza plan announced by Trump last month grew out of his October ceasefire deal, which ended major Israeli military operations there and brought about the release of all remaining hostages, but has otherwise largely stalled. Under the latest agreement, Hamas would gradually give up its weapons while Israeli forces halt their attacks and begin withdrawing from Gaza. Hamas accepted the deal, even as the group linked the surrender of its heaviest weapons to the creation of a Palestinian state, something Israel's current government and most of its political class adamantly reject. Netanyahu rejected the plan, saying Israel would not retreat from any of its positions in Gaza until Hamas has been completely disarmed. That would leave other elements of the ceasefire, including the deployment of international forces and any reconstruction of the devastated territory, on hold. While Benny may have waited until 2025 to utter the words Greater Israel, let's remember that that has always been the project of Israel since its inception. Here's a quick history from Jazeera Plus.
Israeli leaders are once again talking about Greater Israel, a long-standing Zionist vision of an Israeli state that stretches far beyond the territory it currently holds. Just days ago, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called it a historic and spiritual mission.
אז אתה שואל אם אני מרגיש שאני בשליחות היסטורית ורוחנית? התשובה היא כן.
It's a statement with huge implications.
One of the things I want to draw your guys' attention to is that Bibi Netanyahu has this strange habit of saying one thing in English and then saying the things that are really on his mind in Hebrew.
implications, not just for Palestinians, but for the whole region, because it comes during Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza, land grabs in Lebanon and Syria, and wars of aggression across the region. But to really understand why Netanyahu's words matter, it's important to recognize the role Greater Israel visions play in the Israeli national psyche, because it's not a new idea. Well before Israel was established, early Zionist leaders cited biblical texts to envision an Israeli state that would stretch across the region. Zev Jabotinsky, venerated by Netanyahu as his ideological mentor, envisioned a state of Israel that would include the territory of Jordan. The Viennese journalist Theodor Herzl wanted the state of Israel to stretch from the Euphrates River in Iraq to the Nile in Egypt. Even when Zionist leaders accepted the 1947 UN partition plan, they saw it as a temporary tactical move. Israel's first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, made clear this was just a step toward eventually gaining control of all of the land he envisioned as Israel. In other words, what Zionists agreed then could later be expanded by force. And that's exactly what happened. In the War of 1948, Israel expanded the land it controlled far beyond the UN partition lines, and it ensured a Jewish majority in the Nakba by expelling more than 80% of the Palestinian population. In 1967, Israel seized the West Bank, Gaza, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai. And ever since, it has used facts on the ground, settlements, outposts, and military zones to keep expanding its territory across the West Bank. For decades, Israeli leaders avoided publicly expressing support for Greater Israel. But Netanyahu's recent comments shows that Israel's expansionist goals are becoming increasingly mainstream. Some Israelis have openly invoked Nazi Germany's Lebensraum doctrine, land conquest for living space, to justify Israel's territorial expansion. And Israeli soldiers have even been spotted wearing Greater Israel patches in Gaza. And those symbols aren't just rhetoric, they speak to a deeper reality. Because Israel has never set fully fixed borders, keeping its territorial ambitions deliberately open-ended. In fact, most of Israel's current borders are armistice lines from past wars. And even within Israel, there's no consensus on where the country ends. There's a reason Israel has never officially declared its full borders. It keeps them intentionally vague. This ambiguity has always been part of the plan, allowing for territorial expansion whenever opportunities arise. Because if Israel's borders aren't officially set in stone, and it wages war with impunity, what's to stop them from expanding?
Pretty objective history I'm seeing there. And I don't want it to go without comment, but Lazi, I don't even know how to pronounce your name. You need to stop the lies and smearing of Israel. It's doing the opposite of what you want. I have nothing but hate for Al Jazeera and Muslims these days, thanks to your own lies. Do you think that all people in the diaspora believe in Zionism? Let's take a look at that. And let's show you that this is an objective history that is being portrayed. Right now, in American and Israeli media, the dominant narrative is that to be Jewish is to also be Zionist. That is not the case, and has not always been the case. I just want to take a moment of privilege here to read a section from a book that I've really enjoyed for the last several weeks. It's from Molly Crabapple's book, Here Where We Live Is Our Country. And it comes late in the book on page 367 and into 368 in a section titled Conscription. Here we go. The future of the Jewish community in Palestine cannot be built upon latent or open war against the Arab majority of the country as well as against the Arab countries surrounding Palestine, warned the Bund Bulletin in 1947. Quote, however, such a state of affairs would be the inevitable result of the creation of a Jewish state. At the end of 1947, the United Nations approved a partition plan for Palestine, which granted Jews, who were only a third of the population, 56% of the land. Palestinian leadership understandably rejected this offer. The next day, the Haganah sent out mobilization notices to all military-aged men and women, and community leaders in Arab countries similarly began to recruit fighters. As the Jewish Agency's leader, David Ben-Gurion, who was referenced in the video we just watched, wrote at the time, the future borders of a Jewish state would be, quote, determined by force. Let me repeat that. Determined by force. Secretly, Ben-Gurion and his generals began to plan for the realization of their long-held dream, the mass expulsion of the Arab population of Palestine, which is fucking amazing given that in 1947, they had just left concentration camps themselves. The Haganah had money from American Jews and would soon get weapons from Soviet-backed Czechoslovakia. But still worried about their numerical disadvantage, Palestinians outnumbered them 3-2. In March 1948, David Ben-Gurion approved a draft for Jewish refugees in Europe. They were not Israeli citizens, as Israel didn't exist, nor were they all Zionists. The Haganah claimed them as fighters merely because they were Jews, citizens of Israel who are prevented from reaching Israel, but citizens of Israel nonetheless. In the words of the Haganah officer Nahum Shadmi, who led the effort. The draft. Do you hear that? A fucking draft in a displacement camp for an army for a country that did not exist. Most Zionist true believers were already in Palestine, and the Jews who remained in the camps were more interested in building homes somewhere stable than signing up as cannon fodder for a place they'd never been. Quote, most Jewish refugees who had been through the hell of the ghettos, slavery, and death camps under the Nazis, Soviet forced labor camps, and other disasters yearned for some quiet place, wrote the Bundist correspondent Moshe Agzenabud. A report from the Zionist youth movement, Gordonia, put it in harsher terms. Quote, the corruption of these Polish Jews is so great that they are totally uninterested in going to fight in Palestine. Instead, hundreds had registered for American visas. So what happened when these Polish Jews refused to sign up for the draft to fight in a country that did not yet exist? Well, Molly tells us. When appeals to patriotism failed, Zionists turned to stronger inducements. On March 30th, the Congress of Survivors in the American occupation zone of Germany resolved that draft dodgers would be removed from all social and political life. This enforcement went into immediate effect. Camp administrations fired non-Zionist employees, levied fines, threw people out of apartments, and denied them their meager supplemental rations. They published blacklists to publicly shame draft dodgers, targeting Bundists with a special cruelty. In the Eschwege camp, Bundists complained that they were fired from jobs and denied medical treatment. In New Freiman, Bundist art teacher Jacob Selnick lost his job after he refused to register for the draft. And in Gruglaskio, near Turin, Bundists claimed that after a Zionist-led smear campaign, the camp committee's Bundist chairman, Jacob Friedman, was stripped of his position, then his housing and rations, and finally reported to the Italian police as a criminal. In the end, Zionists imposed the draft by force. It was shocking, said the Bundist newspaper Unser Time, and I'm butchering all these names and I apologize. Quote, that Jews, the standard victims of fascism and terrorism, would be capable of the kinds of violence Zionists in the camps exercised toward their Bundist and other non-Zionist political rivals, end quote. Hundreds of affidavits attested to the attacks. That's white supremacy, folks. They literally took people who did not agree with their Zionist project and turned them into the police. What the fuck? In the end, the dream of the Zionists then and the dream of the Zionists now have both made the same mistake. And like I said before, I'm not the man who has the language or the ability to tell you what that mistake is. So I'm going to turn this last bit over to one of the greatest authors in America today, Ta Nehisi Coates.
What is the Black American dream? What is it?
I'm not the person to ask that anymore. I don't I can tell you what the struggle means to me.
Sure.
And the struggle means to me, not just that we would get the boot off of our necks, but that we would destroy the boot, that this would not happen to other people. And I don't think I'm out on a limb on that. Like, I think that's always been the content of our struggle has always been that it's been bigger than us.